has always looked like something out of a fantasy movie, with glaciers, auroras, and endless greenery. But underneath all that beauty, Iceland has a not-so-hidden secret. It caused a disruptive event that would halt air travel. Start of the year, increased earthquake activity and shifts in the crust were already being recorded. And in February, the Icelandic Meteorological Office, in March 2010, a small eruption of an Icelandic volcano attracted thousands of tourists to its scenic crater. No one knew that just weeks later, the same volcano would erupt again, with nearly 20 times the force, spewing 6-mile fumes that canceled over 100,000 flights in Europe. $4 billion lost, millions of stranded passengers. Witness how one volcano turned from a breathtaking spectacle in March to the worst airspace disruptor of the 21st century in April of 2010. Iceland has always looked like something out of a fantasy movie, with glaciers, auroras, and endless greenery. But underneath all that beauty, Iceland has a not-so-hidden secret. It is one of the most volcanically active places on Earth. It's home to over 130 volcanoes, more than 30 of which are still active. In fact, volcanic eruptions in the country happen at least once every 5 years. But how come Iceland never had this scary volcanic disaster image? Why were its volcanoes seen as cool natural wonders, places you'd want to visit on vacation, rather than deadly threats to avoid? Simple. For a very long time, Iceland's volcanoes stayed quiet. The last major eruption before 2010 was all the way back in 1973, way before YouTube was even a thing. In recent decades, eruptions, when they did occur, were usually minor events. More often than not, they even became temporary tourist attractions. I mean, have you seen this iconic video of scientists making lava hot dogs in Iceland? Comment down below. Nobody took Iceland's volcanoes seriously. Even when the iconic Eyjafjallajökull volcano woke up from its 182-year-long slumber in March of 2010, it was seen as just another spectacle, just another tourist attraction. Yes, you heard that right. Eyjafjallajökull. Such a quirky name for a down-bad raging volcano, isn't it? But authorities and locals alike should have recognized the signs that this was going to be unlike any other volcano that erupted in the 21st century. In just a single day, Eyjafjallajökull would release 6-mile volcanic ash clouds, sparking chaos across Europe, and cause a disruptive event that would halt air travel in a way not seen since World War II. There were signs, nobody just bothered to notice. To the public, Eyjafjallajökull's unrest started in March 2010. However, to seismologists, the warning signs started a few months back, in January 2010. At the start of the year, increased earthquake activity and shifts in the crust were already being recorded. And in February, the Icelandic Meteorological Office, IMO, reported the rapid expansion of the Earth's crust near the volcano. This suggested one thing. Magma was entering the magma chamber of the sleeping volcano and was preparing for an eruption. In total, about 3,000 earthquakes were recorded beneath the volcano before it erupted, and on March 20th, 2010, the brewing magma finally breached the surface. A fissure had opened in Fimmvadals, a mountain pass between Eyjafjallajökull and the larger volcano Katla. If this happened anywhere else, the government would likely be alarmed. But this was Iceland. This was nothing. Eyjafjallajökull only scored a 3 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, VEI. At the time, the country experiences about 15 eruptions of this scale each year. So instead of being a crisis, Eyjafjallajökull reached peak popularity in March of 2010. As lava began to flow, the media covered it as a rare, temporary tourist attraction in Iceland. The modest volcano became the new hottest destination in the country, and many wished the lava wouldn't stop flowing. A manager of a hotel near the volcano even admitted in an interview, "I hope the eruption continues for a while, because it is very good for business." And he wasn't lying. Business was doing very well.
It has had a very positive effect on tourism in Iceland to have that eruption happening, and we are waiting for the next one.
Their hotel started offering helicopter rides over the lava due to popular demand. Just imagine how much each takeoff would have cost. On top of that, a popular yet risky volcano trail was reopened to let visitors enjoy the tame volcano's beauty up close. The media framed the eruption as a beautiful, harmless view. However, the fun did not last as many had hoped. Perhaps the volcano took offense at being mocked despite its slumbering fury. Come April 12th, the flank eruption at Fimmvedals came to a halt. But the two-day pause was merely the calm before the storm, as the volcano was brewing a second, far more violent eruption beneath the surface. 2 days later, on April 14, 2010, the country's hottest natural wonder erupted once again. But this time, it burst and melted the glaciers, brewing circumstances that were perfect to trigger a 6-mile-high ash plume. Eyjafjallajökull was no longer the eye candy of travel brochures. Explosions echoed like gunshots. Chunks of red-hot stone flew for miles. The ash was so dense that it turned the locals' day into night. Lava met the glacial ice, sending black fumes 6 miles high. And triggering gushing floodwater made hundreds of people evacuate from their homes. The volcano created a scene straight from an end-of-the-world movie, one that even satellites could see from space. The worst part? The damage was anything but short-lived. The fumes landed as thick layers of ash, covering farmland, homes, and putting locals at risk of lung damage and suffocation. In just hours, wind carried the ash out of Iceland, bringing it to the UK, Norway, and several other European countries. What was Iceland's spectacle became every neighboring country's problem overnight. Shortly after the volcano erupted, 5 flights from the US were turned back halfway through their 7-hour journeys. But that was just the beginning of the horrific aftermath of Eyjafjallajökull's rage in the aircraft industry. And that 6-mile pillar of ash up the sky, see, that was a big problem. This height came close to the cruising altitude of international flights. And since these ash clouds acted like airborne blades and knives, thousands of flights were grounded. One by one, countries closed their airspace. Airport screens shifted from normal departure times to a cascade of cancellations. Each boarding gate was filled with confusion, frantic phone calls, missed events, and rising frustration. What would have been a simple vacation or brief trip for passengers turned into a week-long chaos. Within days, nearly 100,000 flights were canceled worldwide. It crippled air travel in a way that had never been seen since 9/11, and airlines were losing $200 million a day. Norway was one of the very first to suspend flights, and as the ash spread and became riskier, flight restrictions hit other countries across Europe. When the sky grew silent from all the grounded planes, airports shouldered all the chaos. Calling what happened next a logistical nightmare would be an understatement. As screens flashed with cancellations, passengers faced confusion, frustration, and exhaustion. Airport staff bore the brunt of backlash from unsatisfied customers. Among the 10 million people who were affected, there were those who didn't mind the delay and treated the situation as an extended vacation. But those who were already at the airport, ready to board, had the worst luck of all. When they read "canceled" on the screens, nearby hotels around the airport were fully booked in minutes. Passengers began frantically calling hotels and insurance companies left and right, desperate for a stay. Others who couldn't drive home flooded car rental locations, but most were unable to find another way home at the last minute. Tens of thousands had no choice but to camp out at airports, not just overnight, but for days. Airport chairs turned to beds, and the unlucky ones had to sleep on the cold airport floor. Many thought flights would resume in a day at most, but delays pushed back again and again, leaving passengers stranded in the airport for several days. World leaders extended their assistance, but even they weren't safe from the inconvenience. At the time of the eruption, the Norwegian Prime Minister was stranded in New York. Putin had to cancel a trip, and Obama's weekend flight to Poland was left undecided for several days. Halting air traffic for 6 continuous days was an unprecedented decision, but one that officials deemed necessary. After all, ash is not just a visibility concern for airplanes. When a Boeing 747 flew straight into volcanic ash in Indonesia in 1982, all 4 of its engines shut down, and the melted ash turned to glass, choking up the fuel lines and turbine blades. The ash almost cost the lives of over 200 people on board, but the crew miraculously landed the plane safely. Could you imagine if the same scenario were to happen not just to a handful of planes, but thousands? But while everyone was looking at the problematic skies, the locals were facing their own set of nightmares on the ground. The glaciers melting from the lava caused massive floods cascading off the mountain with Amazon-scale currents. Main roads became impassable, and over 800 people were evacuated, most of whom were farmers. Many of the livestock survived, but much of their crops were destroyed. Tourists were no strangers to the floods either. 30 British schoolgirls on a trip near the volcano were also evacuated, but were later allowed to return safely. No casualties, but there were a lot of ruined livelihoods and traumatic memories. The economic effects of the eruption did not stop there. Throughout the week, Kenya lost about $1.3 million a day when it couldn't airlift and export flowers to Europe for almost a week. It had to lay off 5,000 workers to mitigate the losses of rotting flowers and vegetables piling up at the airport. By April 18th to 20th, the eruption slowed down. Yet, to the airline's surprise, airspaces were barely opening up at all. That's when European carriers realized that their own policies were digging them closer to the brink of shutting down. In unison, airlines had to beg officials to reopen discussions that they'd been resisting for decades. Eyjafjallajökull's eruption lasted from April 14th to April 20th, 2010. And though by April 18th to 20th, the ashfall was still noticeable, many airlines began lobbying officials to allow flights to resume. For them, this was no longer just a matter of safety, it was a matter of their organization's life or death. The complete shutdown of air travel was threatening to bankrupt even the biggest carriers. Losses were mounting into the billions, and the industry could no longer afford to lose another day of flights. To have any chance of getting back on their feet, airlines did what was previously unthinkable. They came together and formally requested regulators to define a safe concentration of volcanic ash for aviation. This conversation had come up several times in the past, but airlines had always rejected it. The reason was straightforward. It was a liability issue. If regulators set a safe ash level, yet an accident still occurred due to ash-related engine failure, the legal responsibility for any deaths would likely fall squarely on the airlines. That was a risk no carrier was willing to take until April 2010. After 6 days of being grounded, airlines changed their stance, or more like they had no choice but to. Carriers realized that setting a safe ash threshold was the only path to lifting flight restrictions. Airlines including British Airways, KLM, Lufthansa, and others joined forces to press for immediate change. To support their case, approximately 50 test flights were launched by various carriers to prove a common cause. That by April 18, 2020, the ash concentration was no longer high enough to pose a serious danger to aircraft. Airlines were adamant that flying was already safe, or at the very least, safe enough to resume operations under controlled conditions. The intense lobbying bore fruit as the International Civil Aviation Organization eventually defined the maximum ash concentration levels that engines can tolerate. What was then a vague distinction between normal and dangerous fly zones was now clarified. They established safety limits based on the ash concentration. On the ground, the volcano ash fortunately didn't have serious effects on the long-term health of locals. Those who had asthma experienced temporarily worse symptoms, but multiple tests showed that residents weren't at risk of long-term damage. However, of course, the economic and environmental impact left marks. Houses were buried in mud-like ash sludge, main roads remained unusable for days, crops died, and livestock had to be kept indoors for weeks. Overall, the Eyjafjallajökull crisis was considered handled well by many. But for airlines, letting something like this happen again was too big a loss. So, international efforts to redefine SOPs, safety thresholds, and policies related to volcanic activity began. As mentioned, the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, established clear safe ash concentration levels for aircraft, which are still used today. On top of that, satellite tracking capabilities were upgraded to detect volcanic ash clouds in real time, and the European Union, EU, and national authorities refined operational procedures to minimize disruptions during future volcanic events. If another Heaphiatalactical scale eruption were to happen again today, airlines would be much more prepared and wouldn't be too cautious about flight restrictions. But as a passenger, do you think this is the better move? Would you be willing to fly the skies knowing that there's still ash in the air? Is ICAO's ashfall standard for being safe also safe enough for you? The Heaphiatalactical eruption was just one of hundreds of natural disasters that shook the world. We'll be covering so many more jaw-dropping natural disasters that you've likely heard but never truly understood, so don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Up next, we have